Who opposes the resolutions? Good afternoon and welcome to Elections Committee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have provided the committee with my written testimony, and I'm sure you can read faster than I can read to you, so I'm going to kind of bounce around because I want to allow a lot of time for questions. And let me just start by saying I am Charlie Owens with the National Federation of Independent Business. We're a small business advocacy organization founded in 1943. We have a lobbying presence in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. Madam Chair, I wanted to, because of term limits, give the committee a little bit about my background. I want to apologize in advance. My intent is not to be braggadocious, but to provide some context to my experience in the legislature and with term limits in particular. I've had over 30 years of experience in the Michigan Legislature, both before term limits and after. I, for a time with my company, managed multiple states in addition to Michigan, so I've had experience with other states, in particular Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, where we managed their state public policy program in addition to Michigan's. And so, and also, just as you do with your peers, legislators in other states, I know you get together with NCSL and ALEC and others, and you network and share. I also have opportunities to network and share with my fellow state directors in many other states. So I'm bringing a broad perspective on this issue. I won't go over how we got term limits. I think that's been fairly well vetted out. But let me just say that we're in a unique position of being, to my knowledge, the only business organization, advocacy organization in the state that supports term limits. Most of the other organizations either would like to see them repealed or changed, eliminated altogether, or they have no position at all on the issue. So there were some suggestions that lobbyists like term limits. I haven't found that to be the case. I think I'm the only one you'll probably hear from that's for term limits. The reason that we are in that position is our organization sets our policy positions by surveying our members. We ask them a question, they have an opportunity to vote. And we asked them this question way back in 1991, and they supported the term limits initiative. Now, we all know that when it comes to polls and surveys, it's all in the questions, so I have provided you with the questions that we asked that generated those responses so that you can peruse them. Our goal is to give our members a background on an issue, an argument for the issue, an argument against, and then we just ask a straight up, are you for it, or should we be for it or against it on your behalf, and they vote. So the last time we did a survey on this was 2008, when we became aware that the issue would come up again, as it has here. We did a survey in October, and you have a copy of that in the materials that I gave you. But the primary two questions were, do you believe that Michigan's term limits law is working as intended? 64.2% of our members said they believe that it is working as intended. 24.3% said no, 11.5% were undecided. When we just out and out asked, should Michigan's term limits law be repealed, 78.4% of our members said no, and the remainder, 20%, said yes, and about 2.5% were undecided. And as I indicated, I've provided you with a copy of that question. Now, there's a lot of polling out there. We did a Google poll of the general population of the state, and I have provided you with the details of that poll as well. What we find is the general public sentiment tends to be consistent with our membership, and I think you've already heard that from other testimony, is that term limits are popular with the general electorate as well. We get to the issue of whether term limits are a bane or a blessing when it comes to the pursuit of good governance. And I can say over the 3 decades that I've been here in the legislature that I'm probably going to disagree with many that believe it's diminished, as you heard in other testimony, the legislature, for a number of and I will provide a number of observations. First of all, and again, this is hindsight, and I understand that that's always 20/20, but I really believe, having been here and worked as long as I have, that there are a lot of major policy initiatives accomplished, frankly, by you folks, thank you very much, that I don't think would have ever been accomplished absent term limits. First of all, we wouldn't be having this conversation probably if it weren't for term limits, as another testifier observed, because many of you would not be here but for term limits. Now, I also want to qualify my statements by saying that while it's our perspective that these are great policy initiatives, I respect that there's others that would differ on that. Primarily getting rid of the Michigan business tax, which was the uglier son of the single business tax, and moving to a corporate income tax. I cannot tell you what a huge, my members were complaining about the single business tax. It was put into place long before I even got here, probably 3.5 decades of complaints about the single business tax. The only good thing I can say about that tax is they liked it better than the Michigan business tax that replaced it. But the point is, major tax policy for this state and for small business that I don't think would have ever happened without term limits. The Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund was broke at the end of the previous administration. I don't think that the creative approach to solving that would have occurred without term limits. We had a right to work law pass here, which was a bellwether. That was totally, I have my peers in other states, and by the way, this idea that somehow term limits have diminished Michigan, we are the envy of most of my peers, my other state directors at NFIB. Constantly, how did you do that? We haven't been able to do that for 2 decades, mainly states without term limits, by the way. So this idea that we're somehow diminished, I think, again, it's a different, someone may have a different perspective on that, but I would dispute that. And I could go on with regulatory reforms. I'd like to just real quickly focus on a few things that we were talked about. There's the suggestion that leadership power is greater under term limits than it was before. Well, I don't know if any of you are familiar with former Speaker of the House, Gary Owens, or former Senate Majority Leader, John Engler. But to suggest that they weren't as powerful as today, I think is a bit naive. If you ever had the misfortune of getting on the wrong end of those fellas, Democrat or Republican, they were pretty powerful guys. And this was pre-term limits. The idea that we have diminished ability to deal with bureaucrats and rules is absolutely correct. However, I believe it has nothing to do with term limits. It has everything to do with the Joint Committee on Administrative Rules being declared unconstitutional. You had a very significant oversight function on agency rules that was lost because of that court decision, and it's never been gotten back. And that power has shifted to the executive office. But I don't think that has anything to do with term limits. And finally, I would just like to say, with reference to previous testimony, in particular Bob LeBrand's, the idea of the states that changed their term limits to a combined service in either house. If you look at the past, in addition to the 2016 survey question, I provided you with, we've asked questions on term limits a number of times since they were passed. And on the document it says NFIB member survey questions on term limits. If you go to 2008 question 3, we pretty much asked that question. Should Michigan term limits law be changed to retain the current 14-year lifetime limit on service, 8 years in the Senate, 6 years in the House, but allow lawmakers to serve all 14 years in one chamber or the other? The needle moved to 46.3% yes, no 31.6%, undecided 22.1%. So you see there is a mix there that might be acceptable. However, I want to qualify that with talking about, real quickly, part-time legislature. That question was asked in the context of a part-time legislature initiative that was also part of that mix. So that goofs it up the question a little bit. Let me just say the only time our members ever supported repealing term limits was in exchange for a part-time legislature. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. There are no questions. Thanks for coming in today.
Thank you for the opportunity.
We have 10 minutes and 2 speakers, plus some cards to read in. Greg Schmidt with Don't Touch My Term Limits, Michigan.